some of you all may be already familiar with this phrase from the King James translation, or from the way that it is used in our English language sometimes to mean the minute details. I like it because they're just funny words. It's a funny little phrase. One that had me going way back in my seminary knowledge bank to figure out its meaning, all the way back to the spring of 2013, the semester I took my most challenging class to date, and probably since, Biblical Hebrew. Hebrew, along with Greek, is the kind of course that upperclassmen like to scare lowerclassmen with. It's the kind of class that has you questioning your intelligence, your sanity, and even your calling. Learning a language like Spanish or French is hard enough, but starting from scratch with a whole new alphabet and retraining one's eyes to read from the right to the left is a whole new ballgame. The only way one really gets through a class like Hebrew is to band together with one's classmates and spend hours upon hours quizzing one another with vocabulary flashcards, coming up with funny mnemonic devices to remember those vocabulary words, and to parse verb after verb after verb. My classmates and I, a group of us early on, started doing our Hebrew homework at a Tex-Mex restaurant within walking distance from campus called Trudy's Texas Star. And somehow, by the grace of God, over endless bowls of queso and tortilla chips, and maybe a margarita or two, I learned enough Hebrew to pass my class and to be able to tell you all today just what a jot and a tittle is. A jot is the smallest letter of the Hebrew alphabet. It's actually called a yod, Y-O-D in English. And it looks pretty much just like a little apostrophe. It's actually a pretty important little letter, because with that little yod, you can spell the name of God. A tittle is even smaller than a jot, and it is just a little extension of one pen stroke of the letter. It distinguishes one letter from another, and the presence of a jot or a tittle can render a whole word, a whole phrase, a completely different meaning than without them. I bring up this Hebrew language lesson for us today so that we can understand just how exacting Jesus is getting here with all the jots and tittles, telling us just how serious he is about the law. Not just any law, especially not any Roman or civil or municipal law, but God's law, the sacred Torah, and the prophets and their words of calling people back to the law. We can infer here from today's reading that there must have been at the time some murmurings that Jesus was teaching everyone to disobey or disregard the law, or that he had some new and better law, or some such heresy. But Jesus wants to make it clear that what he is teaching is not some far-fetched malarkey, but he is standing on the same holy ground as Moses and Aaron, as Elijah and Nathan and Isaiah and Micah. And like those voices of old, he is calling the people back to God and to God's righteousness. The law was a gift from God In fact, it was the most important gift from God, and it is inextricably tied to God's covenant with the people. God made a covenant with Abraham. God kept God's promise to Abraham and made his descendants more numerous than the stars. And then many generations later, God saved those descendants from slavery in Egypt, cared for them in the wilderness, and led them to a place they could call their own, where they could flourish and thrive. And along the way, God gave them the first of the law, the 10 Commandments, not only renewing the covenant God had made with their ancestors, but giving them the means to follow that covenant and to live in joyful and obedient relationship with God. More laws followed as God continued to guide his people in the best ways to live, the best ways to honor and worship God, and the best ways to be a community that would care for the least among them and be a blessing to the nations. But the people weren't always good stewards of this gift. The tendencies of human sin led to distortions of the law and misuse of this gift. The law became a weapon to use against others, a tool of power and control, a means of judging others, of determining who's in and who's out, conveniently forgetting that it is God who is the great judge. The law became separated from God's faithfulness and goodness, and the people forgot who they were as children of God and members of the covenant community. And so Jesus reminded the people of their essential identity by saying, "You are the salt of the earth, and you are the light of the world." Maybe Jesus is using a bit of psychology 101 here, attempting to prompt a self-fulfilling prophecy. But on the heels of his words of blessing in the Beatitudes, it's clear that Jesus is encouraging the crowd that has gathered to hear him teach and his disciples to return to the heart of the law and to the heart of God, and to see God's kingdom unfolding around them in the ways God's righteousness works in and through them. And we, like our spiritual ancestors, we also need to be reminded who we are: salt and light. As the salt of the earth, our lives are grounded in covenantal relationship with God. And as the light of the world, we are bathed in the glory of God's grace, set free to obey the law and allowing the light of God to shine in and through us in our actions in the world. Salt was a symbol of the covenant. It is a necessary element for life. It preserves precious stores of food resources. It enhances the flavor of the food gathered from the bounty of the earth. Much like salt, the law is also necessary for the flourishing of life. It grounds us in our traditions, preserving what is important and enhancing our lives. Jesus, though, explicitly warns against what happens when salt is misused and loses its saltiness. I've always found that phrase just a little odd, for salt to lose that which makes it what it is. Because once it's lost its saltiness, can salt even be salt? In the ancient world, not all substances that were called salt were pure salt. Salt was often attached to other minerals, so salt could lose its saltiness if it were not used. If it were kept in storage for long periods of time and the pure salt evaporated with the moisture in the air, leaving nothing but tasteless minerals behind, good for nothing but gravel on the road. We cannot just intellectually hold on to the law, have a righteous mind and belief system, and not apply those principles to our everyday lives. For Jesus, the righteousness of God laid out in the law matters. It matters how one actually lives and embodies the law in every aspect of life. Additionally, salt becomes no longer useful when there is too much of it. How many of us have pushed aside a bowl of gumbo or some other dish upon tasting it and realizing, whew, that is way too salty? They're getting a bad review on Yelp. Too much salt ruins the dish. And if you've ever gotten the chance to visit the Dead Sea, you've seen with your own eyes the complete lack of fish and vegetation and other signs of life that we normally associate with large bodies of water. It is simply too salty at the Dead Sea for life beyond microscopic bacteria to thrive. The church has a history of being too salty sometimes. In all the ways we use God's law and commandments to justify our own prejudice and hatred. It's been used to justify everything from slavery to segregation to systematic poverty to the subjugation of women to anti-Semitism and the discrimination of the LGBTQ community. There is a temptation for us to use the law to armor up and to give others the proper lashing they deserve, but to make us look good. But Jesus tells us that we must take care to not bend the shape of the law to fit our own purposes, but to continually shape our lives around God's good purpose. Balancing out and holding in tension our identity as salt is our identity as light. The light is the reflection of God's grace in us, God's unfailing love and faithfulness, shining its brightest when we are at our weakest. God frees us to live our lives in faithful obedience to the law, and in doing so, God's righteousness shines forth in us. In the light of grace, the law is once again shown to be the gift it was always meant to be for us. Not a barrier around obedience or a limit to faithfulness, but a starting point for righteousness, an opening into life attuned to God's grace-filled will. Our good works, Jesus says, shine before others. But even our good works are not ours. They belong to God, who is the source of our light and recipient of our gratitude as our daily living becomes like the lights along the highway, lighting the way for others to God, to God's goodness and righteousness, and not our own. And just as with the salt, Jesus shares a similar caution about misusing the light, noting that the light does no one any good hidden under a basket, but it fulfills its purpose when it is lifted up and shared with all in the house. We don't hoard this gift of life for ourselves. Instead, we extend it to others. We extend mercy, kindness, compassion, justice, and love to others, and the light of those actions point others to God and give God glory. Jesus is God's light incarnate. In his life, we find the shape of our righteousness. In his complete trust in God and in his obedience, and obedience even to the point of death on the cross for you and for me, following and being obedient to the law is not some call to simple moralism, but a call to a life wholly trusting in God. When we trust in God, in God's promises, when we stand grateful for God's actions, then our lives will be bent toward the life-giving ways God has called us to follow. So as we continually live into our identity as salt and light, continue to discover who we are, and when it gets difficult, because it will, to know what is right and where is the law guiding us, we really can do no better than to remember what Jesus will say later on in Matthew's gospel as he answered the question of the religious authorities who asked him, "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" And Jesus answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law